Last panel of the day. We are a bit tired, but let's say that we are also happy because all the papers presented were really rich and stimulating, as the presentation we are going to listen to now. The first one is by Dagmar Wernitznig. Dagmar obtained her doctorate in history from the University of Oxford with a thesis about the life, work and political activism of the international pacifist, feminist and suffragist Rosika Schwimmer. And she published in the field of gender, post-colonialism, critical theory and cultural criticism as well. And I forgot, she also holds the second PhD degree in American Studies. You see the title of her presentation is a great title, let me say. Please.
Thank you, Teresa, for your kind words, and hello, everyone. I will introduce my paper with a brief theoretic part in order to make the clinical and gender scenario of both post-war treatments a bit more transparent, and then move on to a practical part with examples of female patients involving narratives and traumas of, for instance, displacement, refugeeism, or loss of citizenship. But first, please permit me to explain my chosen title, which actually derives from literature and culture studies. We are here in a literature house, so I think that's very fitting. So the first part of my title for this paper is based on Sandra Gilbert's and Susan Gubar's seminal work, The Madwoman in the Attic, dissecting Victorian literature and concluding that, and I quote, "The sexual was the textual, the personal was the political," end of quote, which bears relevance for our examination of psychiatric files and various archives as well. The ominous madwoman in the attic is, of course, featured prominently in Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. For today's talk, I rephrased this topic by placing the supposed madwoman in the basement, namely bomb shelters towards the end of the Second World War, which caused many female human beings to suffer from severe traumatic stress. What will become clear later on in my paper is that female civilians survived experiences of being buried alive, sometimes for several days, which later manifested itself in traumas and resulted in hospitalization. The First World War opened the short 20th century as a total war, with a newly emerging and as such newly defined home front, including non-combatants of both recruits and casualties behind the official military lines. This blurring of front lines also resulted in a steadily increasing number of wounded and killed civilians. The Great War was also the overture of technical and chemical armory, never before experienced by humankind, and leaving its trace thus not simply on the human body, but also on the human psyche, itself just newly defined by Freud and his many and predominantly male cohorts. This modern age warfare produced modern post-war symptoms such as so-called shell shock. Alternative terms ranged from battle hypnosis to nervous shock or war shakers, which is a direct translation from the German Kriegszitterer, as coined by Emil Kraepelin, one of the pioneers of psychiatry next to Eugen Bleuler. Here is a quote from Kraepelin's autobiography, detailing this seemingly new war neurosis already in 1917, the same year he established the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Psychiatrie, so the German Research Institute for Psychiatry, which certainly was no coincidence. Obviously, I selected the latter translation of his oeuvre into English, otherwise this wouldn't make sense. Now, what is significant here is not simply the staggeringly pragmatic and economic calibration in nonchalant dictum of what to do with these expensive war veterans, who might even be simulating, as is implicitly suggested. What is also evident in this passage is the visibility of the problem with fragile ex-combatants on the street in broad daylight, so to speak, dangerously triggering sympathies from the general public, and thus undermining the war effort or creating a crisis on the home front. As you can also see, I explicitly chose this passage because it illuminates the potential clinical side effects of being buried alive in rubble, which develops into a recurring theme in succeeding scholarly analysis. The phenomenon of shell shock then was increasingly debated in Great Britain after the war. And here we see a parliamentary quote showing that shell shock had made it into official politics already. Nonetheless, what all these discourses have in common is that they starkly excluded non-combatants, so especially female human beings. And it took several decades later, and another war in Vietnam, for the so-called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, to be finally diagnosed and clinically defined as such. We might add that it was the translation of a work by another godfather of psychiatry, namely Eugen Bleuler, into English about 40 years after its original publication that facilitated the American interest in this matter during the emergence of mainstream psychiatry in the 1950s and subsequently in the 1960s, once the war in Vietnam was in full swing, with all the negative psychological consequences for soldiers and local residents. This title by Bleuler was Dementia Praecox, or the Group of Schizophrenias, translated into English in 1950, so 39 years after it appeared in German, paving the way for modern understanding of psychiatry. Now, palpably, no theoretic assessment of feminine-defined illness, particularly mental illness, would be complete without mentioning Judith Butler and her groundbreaking work on the social, cultural, and political conceptions of the female body and mind. Butler's work on dimensions of gender as acts of performativity can be intertwined with the perception, rhetoric, and treatment of disease. Thus, femininity becomes a construct determined by norms, which again filter into classifications of what is and is not normal. One might just think of hysteria as the classic case, stigmatized as a typically feminine symptom or illness in patriarchal psychoanalysis, as most notably, Helene Yu has aptly put it in contradistinction to Jacques Lacan. So questions and parameters of sanity are interfaced with gender expectations, especially in post-conflict times. And on this note, I move on to the actual case files that I encountered in the Corinthian archive. I have to emphasize that this, of course, is a work in progress and that I'm in the preliminary research phase with more visits to other archives that house psychiatric files pending. Now, before I go into detail, let me just elaborate on some aspects and statistics regarding the psychiatric files at the Province Archive of Carinthia, Koroshka, in Klagenfurt-Zelovec. All in all, I inspected over 2,000 documents for the periods from 1918 to 1925 and 1945 to 1950, respectively. I also have to mention that although our project Eirene is concerned with post-war transitions, I started my investigations in the war years and the last months of the two world wars, simply to be able to cross-reference potential developments or differentiations between war and post-war times, concerning, for example, the patient's profiles or the doctor's analysis or other relevant factors that would indicate a detectable shift within a clinical environment from official war to official peace eras. And I will comment on that in more detail in a minute. But before that, some words about the actual clinic, the so-called Abteilung für Psychiatrie at the Landeskrankenanstalt in Klagenfurt. Actually, I couldn't find a picture of the old hospital, so I chose the so-called Fool's Tower in Vienna instead, which I think pretty much conveys it all. The psychiatric hospital in Klagenfurt was opened in 1877 after plans to erect such a building for insane persons since 1840. Before that, mental patients were kept in a former prison, the so-called Zucht- und Spinnhaus, in unhygienic and inhuman conditions, as you can all surely imagine. However, the new clinic was also crowded and overrun from the start, with little staff or funding and constant outbreaks of typhus and tuberculosis. The largest number of patients living at once in this institution was in 1940, with 864. These numbers are based on Herwig Oberlerchner's and Helge Schroberger's studies. Now, some overall details about the female inmates that I studied. The youngest patient I encountered was a 6-year-old refugee living in the DP camp Weidmannsdorf before being admitted in December of 1948 with epilepsy. The second youngest at the time of her hospitalization was a schoolgirl of 14 years and also a refugee, this time from Heidelberg, admitted for schizophrenia in January 1946 and treated with electric shocks. The forms and questionnaires for first-time patients covered several coefficients, such as next to date and place of birth, or subsequent anamnesis and diagnosis, occupation and religious denomination, or marital status. And these, I have to stress, remained the same throughout the study periods. Hence, it is quite striking that generally the social, economic, cultural, or religious norms by which these women and girls were assessed stayed the same for more than half a century amidst drastic changes in society and Europe. Demographically speaking, we can find women from all strata of society, ranging from maids and rural maids to factory workers and teachers, intellectual women, and aristocratic ladies. This is, by the way, another interesting feature that apparently poor women, who obviously could not have afforded their stay in such an institution, were accepted as well, and upon admittance, the financial question was always clarified. So either the patient became a welfare case, or the relatives or persons who brought them into the clinic, suffice to say that voluntarily no woman went by herself, paid the costs. This also leads me to my next observation. In almost all cases, immediate relatives, so parents or spouses, took the women to this institution. In very rare cases, it was their employers, and this happened usually with maids, either on farms or in urban households. Now, while we are on the topic of family members, there are distinct patterns for the post-1918 and the post-1945 era. After the First World War, the overwhelming majority of males in these women's lives, be they partner or father, were matter-of-factly portrayed by staff on the patient's sheets as prone to alcohol and violence. And this, interestingly enough, ran through all classes. For instance, BKM, who stayed in the clinic in November of 1922, was the wife of a high bureaucratic official who was described in extreme frank words as a brutal drunk, while she herself, quite fittingly, was diagnosed with a psychopathic constitution with hysterical traits. Now allow me to share with you one of the cruelest samples of domestic violence that I came across, which happened after the Second World War. 21-year-old B.S., also a refugee in the camp Weidmannsdorf and 6 months pregnant, and I translate and quote from her file, beaten and punched by her husband. According to the doctors, B.S. speaks German badly, but acts completely normal. She was admitted into the clinic in January of 1947 for anxiety, and then picked up 6 days later by the same husband. So with records after the Second World War, the battering stays, but the alcoholism gives way to womanizing and adultery in profiles of husbands and boyfriends. Hence, at this point, we might already ask ourselves how much the note-taking and comments in patients' files were also a mirror of their staff's attitudes or perception of society and the world, plus the staff's adherence to orders by their superiors. Additionally, for post-1945 times, incidents of sexual assaults by perpetrators outside of the family realm are addressed, which is not at all the case for post-1918 records. For both world wars, the element of alienation and drifting apart from the husband soldier, returning from the front as an unrecognizable emotional stranger, is demonstrated in many cases, as is the even lower threshold level of these male family members for violence towards their relatives. We might think here of Susan K. Kent's work about the post-1918 brutalization of British society and frustration on family fronts due to returning combatants in her book Aftershocks, Politics and Drama in Britain, 1918 to 1930, and I believe Jelena will tell us more about this phenomenon soon. Next to this failed identification with the previously loved one, the loss of identity or mourning over lost identity with regards to belonging to a particular state or nation is also frequently uttered by patients. So right after the First World War, we have women lamenting the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy, sometimes also hallucinating that it still exists, or will be resurrected with them as empresses. This was the most common hallucination next to religious ones. After the Second World War, we have a similar situation with women denying the fall of the Third Reich and sometimes imagining themselves as brides of Hitler. Generally, every woman had to state her nationality upon arrival, which was another assessment criterion of whether she had a lucid mind, next to, for instance, solving mathematical equations. So right after the dissolution of Austria-Hungary, a woman who wasn't quite sure which new state she belonged to in the general chaos of rapidly shifting borders in certain areas, especially the North Eastern Adriatic region, was automatically declared insane. Equally, a rural maid, for example, with little or no formal schooling, who could not tackle the math question within a given time, shared the same fate. So what happened if these women were labeled insane? The regular treatment, regardless of decade, diagnosis, or the age of the patient, as you learned before with the 14-year young schoolgirl from Heidelberg, was either opium or electric shock therapy. Here I also have to emphasize that I detected a social hierarchy. Women of higher standing received opium, the poorer others, e-shocks, which tells us quite a lot about the approach of medical personnel towards the individual patients. Especially after 1945, shock therapy, as it was euphemistically called, was almost unanimously employed for refugee women. And this is even more tragic in that most of these women, especially refugees from the East and the South, were described as not being able to speak German because we encountered a laissez-faire comment on the forms, communication not possible. So simply by lacking the linguistic ability of making oneself understood, these patients ended up receiving shock treatment because verbal articulation was one assessment criterion. Therefore, where the demarcations of insanity were sometimes drawn, pretty much depended on the mood of the doctor in charge, and performativity, as Judith Butler calls it, was paramount. Now let's start with some specific files after 1918 and tease out some blatant aspects for the post-1918 timeframe as opposed to the wartime. Whereas until 1918, the average resident in the clinic was either diagnosed as insane from birth or early childhood, spending their entire adulthood and care there as a long-term case, or was an elderly senile woman, basically retired there to die. With 1918, we have an immediate influx of young women, usually in their late teens and early 20s, being hospitalized for short periods of time, normally a few days or at most a couple of weeks. This phenomenon starts in the summer of 1918, when the war was officially still on, and lasts until approximately 1922-23, when these sudden waves seem to ebb away. The diagnosis for these subjects are drastically altered as well. Whereas earlier it was usually and mostly dementia precox, which makes sense with older women, now terms like hysteria, melancholia, inferiority complex, paralysis progressiva, marasmus, mania, or paranoia into the files. Now we can draw our own conclusions about what happened to these women amidst the turmoil and paramilitary violence in Carinthia immediately after the Great War. And remember that I mentioned earlier that rape cases or the element of gendered violence only appear in the documents after another war, so from 1945 onwards. One typical example, quite emblematic for all those young women, is the pupil OZ, who became mentally ill during the war, especially when Carinthia, where she then lived, was attacked. An important factor in her anamnesis is that there are no reported cases of insanity in her family history, so her state is not hereditary. She had to flee to Villach, Bertilotti, where she was diagnosed with dementia precox and TBC. OZ stayed in the Klagenfurt clinic from 1920 to 27, where she died. I translated one of her recorded statements, which encapsulate her longing for former, better times and perhaps the safe pre-war shelter of childhood, because she deplores that she cannot be little old any longer. Another discrepancy I came across and that caught my eye immediately was the actual physical description of the female bodies by medics. Until 1918, and regardless of age or social status, the women were all classified as well-fed, and this we have to remember after 4 long years of war. In post-1918 evaluations, the technical term schlechter Ernährungszustand, so malnourishment, is almost unanimously applied to all new arrivals until about the mid-1920s. As a footnote, it could also be that this was a tactic by doctors to elicit more budget from the authorities in times of need. Furthermore, this evaluation of the physical condition of patients is less evident after 1945, when malnutrition is hardly mentioned at all. This, discernibly, can be interpreted as a political instrument, since especially with lower class and refugee women, it signified that they could physically work once they got released, and not turn into a welfare case, as was depicted by the crippling quote about simulating soldiers at the beginning of this talk. Another macabre detail in that respect after 1945 is that the muscular and bone condition of the women is scrutinized in painstaking detail. And this reminded me of reports of slave markets in the antebellum South in the United States. So it is practically implied by staff that after her release, the female is useful for both either to bear offspring or to accomplish physical labor. How much this was still influenced by Nazi terminology and ideology that until recently dominated that hospital can only be speculated about. The reason I mention this is because there are documented cases of killings, sterilizations, and deportations to Linz, the Hartheim castle to be precise, in that clinic during the Third Reich. Again, I rely on Oberlerchner's and Stromberger's publication in that regard, since they had the chance to investigate the actual clinic archive. But I also found correspondence of a neurologist of this millennium about the grandmother of one of his patients who was murdered there in 1944, requesting her file for therapeutic purposes regarding his patient. And this brings me to my discussion of the post-1945 records. While practically no suicide or suicide attempt is listed after the First World War, which could be interpreted in many ways, for instance as a religious or social taboo and stigma, suicide becomes the standard theme after the Second World War. In-clinic suicides, however, stay exceptionally rare, and this might cater to the hospital's agenda, since successful in-house suicides would taint their reputation as a safe haven for the mentally insane. So we can assume that this could have been covered up to a certain extent. Here's just the tip of the iceberg of post-1945 reported suicidal attempts, which are always related to conflict and post-conflict anxiety and stress. IT attempted to end her life so as not to fall prey to marauding soldiers right after the end of the war in 1945. Similarly, AK, an innkeeper's wife, wanted to hang herself because her husband and son were missing in action. She was admitted in autumn of 1945 and received opium. Notice she had property to show for. The suicidal refugee MP ended up in this clinic several times from 1946 to 47 with hysteria and a morphine addiction. Her husband and son were missing too. MN, a refugee in the DP camp Pfeffernitz, who was brought to the hospital in the spring of 1950 after trying to kill herself. From 1944 to 47, she was interned in Yugoslav camps, her son was missing, and her 76-year-old mother starved to death in a non-specified camp. Next to suicide, the neologism of depression or reactive depression also enters the files after 1945. The post-war displacement on a gargantuan scale, the loss of home and family, paramilitary violence, rape, and the food and sleep deprivation of refugees, most of the times covering long distances on mere foot, directly and in retrospect quite naturally, affected the women's and girls' psyche. However, their grief over lost loved ones or sorrow over missed dear ones was translated by doctors as an unhealthy mental state. AK, for instance, worries about her child because she does not know where it is. The child is not specified. It could be a missing son after the war. She was brought to the hospital twice, in the summer and in the winter of 1945, diagnosed with depression and potential schizophrenia, and given opium because she was a teacher. She's also a good example of someone who, herself being a teacher by her own merits, was nevertheless listed as the wife of a teacher. So the husband's occupation always trumped their own in the records. HB comes to the clinic in January of 1946, suffering from hysteria. Her husband was killed in 1941, and she does not know where all her other relatives are. She was 2.5 years imprisoned in a Yugoslav camp and ended up in a refugee camp in Suicidal. MB is a refugee in the camp Kellerberg. Her husband is missing, and she got separated from her daughter. She was admitted to the clinic in the winter of 1946 and diagnosed with schizophrenia. MS also arrived in the winter of 1946 from Familial. During the war, she was put into a death camp, and after the war, raped by 2 British soldiers. The medics diagnosed her with depression. DRK, a refugee in the camp Weidmannsdorf with no knowledge about the whereabouts of her family, is treated on and off for depression from 1945 to 47 until she's transferred to Yugoslavia in November 1947. Paradoxically, and parallel to these swift overdiagnosis, women and girls were denied an adequate clinical recognition when it came to post-conflict trauma, then already widely acknowledged with her soldier fathers or spouses by the medical community. Here, I think, is an example which subsumes this very poignantly. HR, a refugee in the camp Pfeffernitz, was treated in November 1947 for psychogenic attacks, and she states the following. The attacks started in 1945-46, and many women and girls in the camps had them, but nobody believed them or paid attention. Following up on this, here are 2 cases of classical post-traumata after being buried alive due to the bombings of civilian homes. So here I come back to my original theme. MF lived in the hospital for over a year in 1948 with psychosis. She was buried alive for a longer period, which is not specified, in 1944 after bombardment. Since then, she calls herself a nervous wreck. AP, a refugee in the DP camp Kellerberg, was buried alive after bombings in March 1945. Albeit she sustained no obvious visible injuries, she was sick from then onwards and blind for 6 months afterwards. Plus, she could not talk until 1949. Her left leg and arm were paralyzed since the incident. In 1950, she was transferred as a chronically ill person from the regular hospital in Villa to Klagenfurt. Now, while we are on the topic of transfers, interestingly and bizarrely enough, many patients became involuntary border mediators because the authorities wanted to get rid of them, especially refugee women for political and economic reasons, moved them back and forth across otherwise impenetrable border lines for healthy citizens. Thus, the last word should belong to a female refugee who, after episodes of being constantly uprooted and with a tragic trajectory of refugeeism, wants to literally orientate herself. She has no known date or place of birth, which I think says it all. She ended up in a refugee camp in Pumpendorf after her entire family had fled from Croatia, where, and I quote, "everything is ruined and devastated," end of quote. During the initial assessment talk with the clinic psychiatrist, she gets up and walks to the window to find out where she is right now. And I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your paper that is so rich both from the theoretical and empirical point of view. So next presentation is by Jelena Seferović. Jelena received her PhD at the Department of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Zagreb, with a thesis about the constructions of gender identity among female residents in homes for adults with mental illness. Furthermore, Jelena completed 2 years of education in art expressive psychotherapy, and she has been in Gestalt psychotherapy education since 2015. She dedicates her studies to non-institutional everyday life of people with mental disorders in Croatia of the 19th century and up to World War II. She's going to present a paper about violence of former soldiers of the First World War in the family context, examples from psychiatric institutions. Please.
Thank you. Okay. At first, I would like to say something about my research process. I will represent the result from my archival research that I did within this project, Eirene project. The primary archive source were the patient files of soldiers with mental disorders, former soldiers from First World War, who had been treated in psychiatric hospital in Stenjevac and Pakrac in the period from 1919 to 1924. Research was conducted in the archive of the Psychiatric Hospital Vrapče and the Museum of Pakrac. The only statistical data on the number of the patients treated in Stenjevac, which is currently known to me, related to the period covered by this research, suggests that there were 511 people hospitalized in this year. The number of archived patient files in Vrapče from the 1919 did not correspond to the previous data recorded in the monograph of Stenjevac from 1933. I could not read the statistical data on patient admission in Pakrac, neither in the research archival material nor in the professional literature. Judging by the number of the patient files of patients treated in this institution during the research period, I would point out that there were between 70 and 100 per year, but because of the experience of research in Vrapče, I won't make statistical conclusions of Pakrac. I decided to focus on the consideration of the archival material from the first 5 years after the end of the war, as in the forthcoming period the cases of former soldiers will almost uncorded. This fact is well known to me from past research of this archival material. The continuation of the research will imply analyzing the patient files of the widows of the former soldiers from the First and Second World War with a view to looking at the transition period from the perspective of the indirect warrior participants. Then I would like to tell you something about the history of these two psychiatric hospitals. This is entrance in Vrapče. Psychiatric hospital in Stenjevac and Pakrac were both established during the Austro-Hungarian period. Stenjevac, today Psychiatric Hospital Vrapče, started to work in 1879. Negotiation on building this hospital lasted for 2 years because government was in dilemma where they would build it. The initial idea was to set up in the center of Zagreb, but in the end, the government bought the land in the city outskirts named Vrapče. The building was intended to accommodation 200 patients, but the planned capacity was soon exceeded, so it was necessary to build another psychiatric institution, and this is Vrapče. Now, Given the fact that Stenjevac was undercut and that the same situation was evident in the psychiatric department of General Hospital, General Hospital in Pakrac, in 1910 was built a building for the psychiatric patient very near this institution, and this is the entrance on the Pakrac Psychiatric that was ruined during the war in Croatia. Unlike Rapture, this hospital is no longer in service. As the beginning of the war in Croatia in September 1991, the Pakrac Psychiatric Hospital was evacuated, while patients were relocated to the other similar institution in Croatia. During the war, the building was devastated, as you can see from this photo. This photo I made it when I was at field work in spring in Pakrac. Now, I would like to say something about their hospital daily life. Before going deeper in analysis of the subject of discussion, I will briefly discuss the organization of hospital everyday life that were essential structure. Most of the patients were involved in active or is called today work therapy. Women assisted in the hospital, kitchens, hospital rooms, etc., while some of them doctors and other senior employees took in their home to serve them. From today's perspective on the right of persons with mental disorders, the use of psychiatric patients for the purpose of serving in private homes of their psychiatrists will represent an unacceptable breach on their human rights. However, in the period from the medical and social criteria for the treatment of persons with psychological disorder were different from this recent. The men work as carpenters and farmers. In one word, they did traditional men works. During the 20s of the 20th century, the vast majority of patients come from villages and therefore mostly engage in the agriculture works. However, soldiers with mental disorders were almost impossible to include in any form of organized work because of their very clear symptoms of mental illness and physical exhaustion. Now I will leave you to read something that I found in patient files, and this is the case from Stenjevac, as you can see. I will not read it because we don't have enough time. You can read it yourself, and if you need any information about my research, you can write me. I just wanted to say that this quote refers to the 20-year-old man, and is just one of the many from which we can see clearly of psychophysical condition of soldiers who have experienced trauma on the battlefield. Although from its content we can also see how their family waited for the return, accepted them, they would be able to use them immediately for works at the field that were a source of rural household existence. However, the reality was completely different. Traumatized soldiers were not able to actively engage in post-war everyday life, which further underlined the already existing frustration of family members who did not directly participate in the war but were equally mentally and physically ill. Dagmar said something about war neurosis. I will just tell you just a few more details about the shell shock. As you know, one of the fundamental features of the World War I warfare was shelling and gas attack on soldiers in trenches and fortification. The soldiers have died most of the consequence on explosive grenades, gas poisoning and illness, but soldiers suffer not only from physical disease but also from mental disorders. Mentally ill soldiers were disoriented in time and space. They became confused, they had hearing and visual hallucination, phobias and other forms of mental disorders. They were no longer social functional as they were before. Bearing in mind that the traditional archetype features of the soldier include heroism, strength, psychophysical endurance, and that these soldiers, due to traumatic experience, were not able to fulfill the ideal of the perfect soldier, they were often degraded and labeled as weak and cowardly. Following quote will clearly show the experience of shell blast explosion as well as understanding of the environment or physical condition of this soldier. It's okay, can I? Considering that the appearance of war now I will tell something about the family violence. Speaking of family violence, I would point out that this aggression on soldier was primarily targeted at wives and children, but that the victims of their violence were also members of wider family and neighbors. Violence involved the use of physical force and psychological violence. I have not come across a case of sexual violence, but that does not mean that it doesn't exist, but that it was not recorded. Speaking of sexuality was generally a taboo. Michel Foucault, in the first of the 3 parts of the history of sexuality, says that the first demographic and psychiatrists in the 19th century, when they had to mention sex, though they owe the apology to the readers, keeping their attention on such antagonistic content. The author adds that even when we talk about sex, we have a somewhat special attitude. So it is no surprise that if there were any case of sexual violence, that is not reported, I guess because of the shame, as we said before. In addition, the question in whether the victim could recognize it, because some sexual behaviors which are known today, that they are inappropriately and leave profound negative consequences on their victims' emotional lives, were not perceived as a danger in this period. As we spoke before, sexual violence is not just rape, there are lots of levels of this phenomenon. According to one of the definitions, domestic violence is a set of behaviors whose purpose is to establish power and control over the people by using force. The Spanish psychiatrist Jelena Seferović, in this article, Transphenomenological Perspective of Psychopathology, indicate that loss of personal freedom and autonomy implies a loss of power. According to Pellegrina, the destructive power agoraphobia lies in the inability of the patient to take possession of space as a personal world in which he can raise a truth which he can move. In this case, the destructive power of mental disorder of former soldiers lied in their inability to function in the society in the way they functioned before mobilization. Now it's one also example. As it seems, first of all, they were not able to cope with the symptoms of their illness. Secondly, they were not able to carry the frustration of the fact that they were no longer able to realize the traditional gender roles intended to men. It is very likely that the feeling of powerlessness was a risk factor for the development of their emotional and social anxiety. An additional difficulty was that there were no time and space for trauma in the family environment because life in the village moved around, exhausting all-day work, which was also the most common and certainly the most important theme of the conversation. According to Susan Alec, a Croatian historian, in the interwar period in the rural area families, when they was discussing, it was never about the personal feeling of desires, but all about real external problems that were of the whole household. In the end, former soldiers, as they lost their power over their own lives, sought to establish power in the family through aggression. Their frequent uncontrolled aggression that appeared to other family members, as well as to members of the wider community, eventually led to the collapse of family, which is clearly seen in this slide. But there were also problems as, violence in the wider environment. Here it is. As I said, there were not only problems for their own families, but also from the wider environment. Family could not cope with the return of often physically incapacitated and mentally ill men. They expected that they will come equal from the war as they have been before. A lot of time I noticed in the patient files that Psychiatric wrote for them, he's not like he was before. Sometimes this looked like to me as the society was surprised of their mental and physical disability and think that they were like they were before, but they couldn't be. Apart from physical and psychological violence, it was apparent from the research that former soldier was conducted also an economical violence. So there will be economical violence, psychological violence, and also physical violence, and the sexual is not mentioned. And this is one of the examples. Economic violence primarily involves the cohabitation of disposing of personal income, the ban on employment, etc., but also involves the destruction of personal and collective property. On the one hand, They did not know how to express their feelings, but on the other hand, their family members did not know how to handle with their aggression, so they returned if they could them on the same way. At the end, they made together a vicious circle of aggression which just triggered new family conflicts. And at the end, the breakdown of family relationship was something that was very, very often. But psychological and physical economic family violence was not only for or the showing aggression of this population. Namely, it was also manifested through their passive-aggressive attitudes, through the lack of interest in everyday activities, apathy, then inability to assume responsibility for their own action, and delinquent behavior. And here is the one. Can I? Okay. And I just want to say at the end that today is the 6th June, and on this day, by the order of the royal government in 1880, the Psychiatric Hospital Estonia adopted its first statute, and it is the first document in Croatia in which are mentioned the rights of people with mental disorders. So today we celebrate the National Day of People with Mental Disorder. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jelena, and thank you both of you for your papers. I think now we have the time for the discussion because she was so I want to ask a question to both of you. You refer explicitly to the woman, the Madwoman in the attic. That I love, it's a book that I love. And so I would like to know how do you deal with the, let's say, psychiatric narrative considering your point of reference, this point of reference. And also to Jelena, how do you deal with the hospital narrative? Because I think they are quite interesting also to know about the idea of masculinities and...
You can first.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. This is a very good question, actually, because we heard a lot about this all day, that and the circles that judge women, and that's exactly what I in a way calibrate when I look at the narrative that you refer to. So there were two things that were quite well, very, very obvious actually. You don't necessarily have to have a war or a post-war era for women to somehow be stigmatized as insane or not normal. I mentioned this dialectic of norm and abnormal. Because the mere violence, they had to put up with domestic violence, for instance, and then of course the hard labor usually rural maids had to accomplish, and so on and so forth. So yeah, this is a very good question. How do you actually factor that into the psychoanalytical violence? And then of course the second obvious factor then was the norms for these women and their behavior. I had maids who were later on, after 1945, the rapes are more explicitly expressed, but just the non-incestuous rapes. I only found one case of incest where an uncle raped his 12-year-old niece. So this was even more a taboo than the actual rape. That the mere fact that these women actually defended themselves already in a way made them suspicious. Or if they didn't defend themselves, we have with this narrative that the doctors craft, especially after 1945, they are described as loose women. The way these women tell the stories is being interpreted as she shows her cleavage, she's proud of this. So, and we only have male doctors there and mostly male staff. So yes, I'm keep it short.
I can agree with what Dagmar said, but I can also say in cooperation with something that you said and something that I shown to you and that is something that I know about other female patient files, I can say that there are differences in psychiatry in Croatia and the psychiatry in a richer country that it was Austria. And also there is differences between writing patient files from Vrapče and Pakrac. Vrapče was a richer hospital and there were more doctors, they had much time, and they're all well educated also in Switzerland or Austria. And I don't know where were educated the psychiatric for Pakrac. I have to research that. But I think they were doctors, but I don't know where they get their degree, so I'm not sure. So I think on that it depends the way they were writing the patient files, from my experience.
Thanks both for these interesting talks. I have a question for Dagmar. You said before that you have an increased hospitalization for attempt of suicide after Second World War. I want to ask you, why? So I found a lot after First World War. I talk tomorrow about that also. Maybe before was not hospitalized, this attempt of suicide, because I found a lot of news in the newspaper that they say, okay, the women try to suicide, we go to hospital and she comes back to home, like ill. And this is just a curiosity, a question. So maybe crossing the newspaper and I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the newspapers are a different source, and that's where you find it. Especially what I found was unmarried mothers trying to drown herself when they're pregnant. And this also, we talk about a rural area. A lot of suicide were simply not recorded. I mean, we have the religious taboo. A maid hanging herself in the barn. Women have a lot of, also the way how they kill themselves. It's quite interesting. You have all these, today you have the analysis, men usually in the States kill themselves with guns because they have more women better access to guns, and women slit their wrists. You know, it's a passive way of killing themselves. It's a feminine way of killing themselves. But you're absolutely right. If you look into other sources than the psychiatric files, you have the newspaper reports, especially with those unmarried mothers with illegitimate children going into the water trying to drown themselves. But you have also the reports of the rural police, the so-called gendarmerie. And of course, these so-called unfit mothers, they are focused on because they're not married, and usually these pregnancies resulted from rape as well. This is what I mentioned earlier with, you don't have to have a war, post-war time. I mean, these women suffered, you know, during peace times as well. But again, we talk about a rural area, and they're covering up suicides. There's entire, you know, storytelling and narrative about this, how maids or the daughter, you know, she gets pregnant and she kills herself, and you have plenty of, the environment, you know, gives you a lot of opportunity, whether it's lakes or rivers or barns. And then it was just simply, as I mentioned, there probably were in-house suicides in the hospital. It just did cover it up for obvious reasons, because this would taint their reputation. I found 2 or 3 that were successful.
Thank you for this very interesting talks. I have also only one question to add to this discussion about the psychiatric culture and about the files and documents. I check a part of Ljubljana psychiatric documents and about the First World War period and about the Second World War period, post-war period, and I'm convinced that I could check only a part of the documentation. And for this reason, it's absolutely it's important to add other type of data or other type of documentation. And so this present of the silence, and also I think a silence about the therapy, because I saw one interview with one director of psychiatric hospital in Ljubljana, and this was the director during the 50s, and he described horrible conditions in the building of Ljubljana Psychiatric, but no words in the files. No? And this discrepancy is absolutely important for our analysis. So I think that will be a very strong deal to connect all our part of research. But I think that finally we will find also this different hospital situation, different culture, because I know in Trieste the situation was absolutely different, and also the narrative was more rich, because I know Eduardo Weiss, the pupil of Freud, naturally had a different attention at this type of also of war traumas and so on. But okay, we now are in the middle of the research, and I hope that all these topics will be more clear in the next years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talks. And I have a question for Jelena. My question is, these guys were violent, but what was considered as violence exactly? And then in relation to the hint of Teresa on masculinity, you analyzed files of female patients and male patients, right?
This is based on male patient, but before. Yeah, because before I analyzed female.
There were reported the same quality of violence, the same kind.
No, because in the female patient files, sometimes. Sorry. Sometimes in. How? No, it doesn't work. Okay. This is a very interesting question because in the female patient files sometimes is mentioned they have been sexual abuse, but in male patient files it doesn't exist, and that's why when you ask me about the violence, what was concrete, that's why I show you those examples, because you can see there was attacking with a knife. There was alcoholist. They attacked their child, the children. Because of that, the relationship in the families were broken. But it was those behavior was aggressive and in traditional way. But those were the examples before they came in the hospital. So I don't know what happened when they came home, because I didn't find any files that prove that they have been hospitalized, they came back home, and then they were returned to the hospital. So I don't know what happened after.
So there wasn't a different gender perception of violence.
Yeah. It's interesting thing that that situation. Sorry. It's very interesting about the sex, how sex violence that a female told to the psychiatrist that they were abused and that these were written there. And in the case of male, it wasn't, because I think that psychiatrists in one part of the file wrote what the patient told to him. And I'm sure that that male who did violence, did abuse her wife, didn't told that he was doing that. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a very interesting methodological thing. In some of my paper I can write about that, how there are differences in the way of telling about the thing on the violence they did. Yeah, and I will compare that. Thank you. Thank you for the question and inspiration.
It's not a question, just when I was doing research on war neurosis in psychiatric hospitals, I remember many letters from soldiers to the family. Many of them were full of expression of affection. Soldiers, it seems to me, discovered the family affection. Many of them, many letters instead, were full of anger and anxiety on the freedom of the wives, and full of threats. So I don't know if you find this kind of letters. And about the clinical diary, I remember the clinical diaries of soldiers were accurate. Clinical diaries of women are complete, maybe completely very few lines, so very few lines. And women, it seemed to me, non si aspettavano, they didn't expect to be cured and to be observed, to be, and they shoot themselves in silence.
All right, thank you so much for those excellent papers. I have a question both for Dagmar and Jelena. It's kind of a tangential question, so I apologize. It was kind of from a place of deep curiosity. And that is, during the 1920s and early 30s, there was, at least in North America, there was this, it was kind of a heyday for eugenic science and hereditary science. And I'm curious, was there, with regards to treatment, or what was believed to be treatment, was there ever talk of hereditary science or negative eugenic sterilization? Because in North America in the 1920s, it was a third of the United States, like they passed laws for non-consensual sterilization, and women were overrepresented, as were refugees and immigrants. So I'm curious if there was ever any discussion about hereditary science and eugenics, negative eugenics specifically. I'll bring it up.
Well, maybe people can. Should I start? Well,
Okay, I will. The answer is no, in my case, and that's a question I got when I was in the beginning of 2015, when I was talking about the neuropsychiatric hospital Popovac, about this history. One professor asked me the same question, but in his case was the period of Second World War, but it wasn't. I think that our hospital in Croatia was not so rich, because they function with their agriculture fields around us. They were not so rich as they were in USA. That is my case. I think it is my theory, but I didn't find any data about that.
No, I can't keep it short. No, I didn't either. And the treatment, as I mentioned, was simply opium or electric shocks. I mean, they didn't really bother with these women. And when they were refugee women, electric shocks, and then we just get rid of them. So, and of course, there were all you mentioned, the doctors being educated in Switzerland and Austria, and crippling, because everybody, Anna emailed me that, Anna Chergol actually emailed me that, because she thought the doctors would be educated in Vienna, and there's still this Freud-based thing. But they were actually, the Kraepelin and the Bloilo school were vying against each other as well, and so there was a war going on in terms of what kind of treatment you have. But from the files, it will be interesting looking into the files in Vienna, because they might have been more progressive. Also with what Marta is, with the hygiene conditions and everything, because what I found in Carinthia was also, they were pretty much gridlocked in the Freudian conception of hygiene as well, when the woman uses basically feces or something like that. So, and then of course you have the unhygienic conditions per se, and in Vienna it might be different, not only because it's more urban, but also there are different clinics there that I can inspect. So, yeah.
Really, thanks a lot, because I appreciated both of your papers. I just was thinking now, we have maybe a problem. The different treatment of women mental disease, mental disturbs after the war, because is in your paper, did you find maybe sometimes that women in this case are recognized like victims of the wars? I don't think so. And so you have already a strong difference in the treatment between men and women, first. Second, then we have the displacement disease, I don't know how to call it, from the refugees that you treated, and there are victims of war, of course. But what is interesting is how these doctors, they treat this kind of disease, using electroshock, used always for hysteria, and so on, and opium, just to calm down women that are they think too much, maybe. And do you know something what happens after? Because many of these women that you collected, the files you collected, they are not from Austria, but they are displaced persons. So, what happened to them? Don't you know anything about them? First, and then, the role of psychoanalysis. Because as Marta said before, of course, in Trieste, Weiss treated soldiers with a psychoanalysis method. But psychoanalysis was also a question of money in the treatment. So, and this has to do what you, Jelena, said before, that all these hospitals you study were not rich.
Yeah.
And so I think it's good to understand the education path of these doctors and to see how they treated this post-traumatic war stress and so on.
Excellent. I agree with all you said. I mean, it was a masculine-defined diagnosis and treatment. So the women, they were just not. And as I mentioned earlier, you cannot win. Actually, there's this movie by Clint Eastwood, directed by Clint Eastwood, with Angelina Jolie. I mean, sorry to sort of trespass on the sort of popular, but they tell her, you can't, if you don't say anything, if you try to be silent and cooperative, you're lethargic. And if you try to make yourself understood, you're hysterical. And so that your second point, you hit the nail on the head, because this is what I encountered story after story, whether this was a local woman or an alien woman, we just need to sedate her. For the richer ones who can afford it, it's opium. For the other ones, it's electric shock. And you see it in the storyline, in the narrative. First she's hysterical, then after the first electric treatment, she's fine, you know. And then, so, so, and I can't remember the last part you commented on.
Yes, the role of psychoanalysis, because
the training of the training of the doctors. Yeah. So for me in the clinic that I investigated right now, it pretty much stayed the same as I mentioned in my paper. So for decades, they just adhere to sort of the very old-fashioned for our modern perception treatment. Yeah. But I totally agree.
In my case, I didn't see any difference between the men and treating with men and the women. They all were from villages, so they didn't have any money for psychoanalysis or anything else. They were treated exactly the same. The most important thing was that they can work, and that's why I mentioned there the everyday life. It was the main thing in the hospital, because the hospital had to live. And the hospital lived because of their work on the fields, and the patient.
On the field, the hospital.
Yes, and the patient eats the food from what they did on the agriculture of the hospital. So it was some kind of infrastructure in the hospital. So if they could work, they work. So if they were calm, they will sleep. As I mentioned there, some women served in the doctors' houses, and I think it's incorrectly and at all. And they didn't get any money for that. Another thing, they helped in the hospital, in the kitchen, in the rooms. So they had to be active. And that was the most, and that's why I mentioned work therapy or active therapy. That was the most important therapy because it served hospital.
Okay.
That was politics. That was the reality.
So we have time for a last question. Is there any way to hear women voices? I mean, in your case, it's women at home, and I don't know, diary, letters.
I of course investigate diaries and letters as well, but they're not in the psychiatric files. And I also found out in Vienna how women disguised their war experiences. I found memoirs, especially for the children. This is again this feminine take. We write it for our children. Disguised as recipe cookbooks, and you know, the camouflaging of your own experience, because still you can't bring the personal into the political sphere. But I did encounter a lot of let's call them stream of consciousness almost talk in a lot of women who came from Vienna, and there we have maybe the different demographic differentiation. A very interesting story. I mean, one I couldn't stop reading, and this is part of the psychiatric files. Of course, I couldn't integrate them today, but it's fascinating. This one woman, this is the most superb analysis of what war is and what the role of women in war is. And interestingly enough, it entered the files, and it pretty much always depended on who took the notes. You know, maybe this was a nurse who sort of in a way felt solidarity with this woman, but the narratives are there, of course, parallel to the diaries and the letters and everything.
In my case, I found just few letters, chaotic letters, which was not sent to their homes, because most of the patients, as I said, was from villages. They didn't went to school, they didn't know how to write, so that was the reality. Yeah, it's totally different with urban psychiatry and rural psychiatry, totally different thing. That is what I found out through research and through conversation with Dagmar, and it's very interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions? No. So let's thanks everybody, because it was a great